I always believed that after 35 years of marriage, nothing my husband could do would truly shock me anymore. I thought I knew every corner of his heart, every flaw, every habit, every secret he allowed to surface. But life has a strange way of proving that the people closest to you can still carry entire hidden worlds behind the calmest smiles. And on the morning of my 63rd birthday, when I walked into my own living room expecting nothing more than a quiet family breakfast, that hidden world finally collided with mine in a way that almost knocked the air out of my chest. That I remember hearing voices before I even entered the room. Not the usual familiar chatter of my children or grandchildren, but a cluster of whispers that felt restrained, uneasy, as if the speakers didn't know whether they even belonged in that space. My hand was still on the door frame when I heard my husband's voice, low, nervous, rehearsed, say, "Just, please, let me tell her first." It froze me completely. He sounded like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. At first, I genuinely thought it was some kind of surprise party he had failed miserably at coordinating. It wouldn't have been the first time he bungled a plan. But when I stepped into the room, and 5 pairs of eyes turned toward me, 5 unfamiliar eyes belonging to people I had never seen before in my entire life, the world under my feet seemed to tilt sideways. A woman stood closest to him, around my husband's age, though slightly younger. Her posture was tense, and her hands were clasped in front of her like she was preparing herself for something inevitable. Beside her stood 3 grown adults, 2 men and 1 woman, who all had the unmistakable facial structure my husband passed to our own children. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't need an explanation, the truth hit me instantly, with a sharpness I felt in my bones. My husband took a step forward, opened his mouth, and nothing came out. Only silence, heavy and suffocating. The strangers watched me cautiously, as though waiting for me to explode. I didn't. I just looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something inside me go utterly still. He finally whispered, "Mary, please sit down." I stayed standing. He swallowed hard and continued, they're my family. My first family." And in that moment, the room became painfully quiet. The air felt thick enough to choke on. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink for several heartbeats as the meaning of those words tore through me. First family. Not past mistake. Not old friend. Family. The woman stepped forward with a trembling breath. "We didn't mean to cause harm. We only came because today," she stopped, searching for courage. "Today is the anniversary of their mother's passing, and your birthday. He promised he would introduce us one day. He said he would when the time was right." I felt my blood run cold. They spoke with such certainty, such practiced acceptance, as though they had been waiting for this introduction for years, while I had been living my entire marriage blindfolded. My husband looked down at his shoes, unable to meet my eyes. "It was before I met you," he said quietly, "but the relationship, it continued longer than you knew. We had separated many times, but I never fully left them. I supported them. I visited. I was there for birthdays, for school events. They knew about you, Mary. I just didn't know how to tell you about them." My hands began to tremble, but I clasped them together to steady them. My voice, when it finally emerged, was calm, too calm. "How long have you been seeing them?" He hesitated, then said the number that collapsed: 35 years of trust in a single breath. 30 years. The sting in my chest was immediate and fierce. 30 years. Which meant through newborns, anniversaries, illnesses, arguments, vacations, and every Christmas morning, he had lived a second life parallel to mine. One of the grown sons stepped forward, his voice gentle. "We're not here to replace anything. We just wanted to know the woman who shared his life. We wanted to understand the missing half of his world." Missing half. The phrase was almost cruel in its accuracy. My husband had lived divided between 2 families, one visible, one hidden, while I thought we were whole, but instead of falling apart, something unexpected happened inside me. I felt a quiet clarity rise through my shock. Betrayal, yes. Pain, undeniably. But also a strange, almost eerie steadiness. Because standing there, in front of these strangers who shared my husband's blood and history, I realized that although I knew nothing about them, they knew everything about me. Every birthday, every milestone, every detail of my marriage, they must have observed from a distance like spectators watching a play they weren't allowed to join. That my husband stepped closer, his voice cracking. "Mary, I never meant to hurt you. I wanted to protect you. I thought if you never found out." I lifted my hand, stopping him with a single gesture. "You thought wrong." The woman, his first partner, lowered her eyes. I noticed then how tired she looked, how worn the years had made her. Not my enemy, not my rival. Just a woman whose life had been bound to his long before mine ever crossed paths with him. She carried her own grief, her own loneliness, her own decades of secrecy. I drew in a long breath and finally spoke in a steady tone that surprised even me. "I need a moment." The hours that followed felt strangely suspended between disbelief and a sharpened, almost electric awareness of everything happening around Margaret. When her husband had stood in front of their family, boasting that she should be grateful he kept her around, Margaret had expected the usual pattern to follow: silence from the children, side glances, and some awkward excuse to change the topic. But something inside her no longer trembled or shrank back the way it once did. Instead, she watched everyone in the room with a clearer mind than she'd had in years. It was as if the fog that had once clouded her instincts had finally lifted, revealing every shift in posture, every strained smile, every guilty look that had been there all along. Her husband sat at the end of the table, head thrown back arrogantly as he retold stories from years ago, conveniently editing details to make himself appear heroic or self-sacrificing. Margaret noticed how the children nodded, though half-heartedly, more out of habit than conviction. Her grandchildren fidgeted, uninterested and restless. The atmosphere was brittle, like old glass, easily fractured with the slightest truth spoken aloud. Yet what struck Margaret the most was the heaviness in her son's expression. He kept glancing toward the hallway where her husband's briefcase had been placed earlier. Each time his gaze drifted in that direction, there was tension in his jaw, as if he were hiding something he desperately hoped no one would notice. Margaret had always been the type to assume the best of those she loved, but after years of being dismissed and minimized, she had developed a sharper sense of observation. She could tell when guilt was eating at someone, and her son looked like a man on the verge of slipping into panic. Her daughter, meanwhile, avoided eye contact with her completely. That alone spoke louder than any words. Margaret had sent her small gifts earlier in the year, nothing extravagant, just meaningful things like knitted scarves, handwritten notes, or little items that reminded her of childhood traditions. All of them had gone unanswered. And now, sitting across from her, the daughter looked down at her plate with a discomfort that suggested she knew the truth behind her silence. Not once had she stood up for Margaret, even though she had witnessed the belittling comments for years. Now, faced with her own complicity, she stared at her food like it was part of a test she was failing. The grandchildren, though oblivious to the heavier currents in the room, sensed that something wasn't right. Children often picked up on tension more accurately than adults realized. They were quiet, glancing at their parents, glancing at Margaret, unsure of how to act. Margaret gave them gentle smiles whenever their eyes met. If there was one thing she would never allow to be poisoned by bitterness, it was the love she held for them. Across the table, her husband continued bragging, unaware that the dynamics had shifted. He talked about how hard he had worked for everything they had, how much responsibility he bore, how lucky she was to have a man like him at her side. Every word was a thread pulled from a tapestry of self-importance he had spent decades weaving. But as he talked, Margaret found herself studying the people around him, not the man himself. She watched how their shoulders drooped, how their interest drifted, how the children whispered behind their hands. It dawned on her that the person who believed most strongly in his myth was him, and him alone. Then something subtle but significant happened. When dessert was served, her son got up quickly, almost too quickly, and excused himself to the other room. Her daughter followed moments later. Her husband didn't notice, too absorbed in lecturing the remaining family members about financial responsibility and hard work. Margaret, however, gently rose from her chair and slipped away as well. The hallway was dim and quiet, but she could hear murmured voices coming from the adjacent room. Her children were arguing in hushed tones, their voices strained. She stopped before they could notice her presence. "What were you thinking taking that out of Dad's briefcase?" her daughter hissed. "I just wanted to see if it was true," her son whispered back, sounding defeated. "Mom deserves to know." "You're going to cause chaos," the daughter warned. "Just put it back. Pretend you didn't see anything." "I can't." Dad lied. "For years." His voice cracked slightly. "And we believed him." Margaret leaned forward, listening without breathing. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared they might hear it. Her instinct told her this moment was important, dangerous, even, but she didn't move. She needed to hear what they were hiding, her son continued, voice trembling with a mix of regret and anger. "He's been spending her pension. A lot of it. Not on the house, not on us, not on anything," he claimed. "It's all withdrawals. Cash. And not small ones." Her daughter exhaled sharply, as if winded. "So you're telling me Mom hasn't been careless with money? That he, Dad, was lying every time he blamed her?" "Yes," he answered. "And that's not even the worst part. There are transfers to a woman's account." Margaret's hand clutched her chest. Even though she'd suspected for years that something was wrong, some financial secret, some hidden betrayal, hearing the confirmation felt like cold metal pressed against her heart. The silence that followed in the room was suffocating. "Does Mom know anything?" her daughter asked, voice trembling. "Not yet," her son said softly. "But she will." At that moment Margaret stepped back, unwilling to hear more. She returned to the dining room with a slow, steady walk. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even angry, not yet. What she felt was clarity, an unmistakable sense of direction she hadn't had in years. Secrets always rose to the surface, eventually. And the truth, finally, was aligning itself at her feet like a path she knew she needed to follow. Her husband barely looked at her as she took her seat again. He was still talking, still gesturing grandly, still performing for anyone who would listen. But now Margaret watched him with different eyes. Every boast sounded like a confession. Every laugh sounded hollow. Every word was a thread unraveling a story he could no longer control. When her children returned to the table, their faces were pale. They sat down quietly, not meeting her gaze. But Margaret didn't push them. She simply folded her hands, waited, and breathed. She had spent a lifetime shrinking herself so that others didn't feel uncomfortable. Now, she felt herself expanding, gently, naturally, inevitably, into someone she should have been all along. The truth was out there now, hovering in the air like a storm that could no longer be stopped. And Margaret, for the first time in decades, felt ready for whatever came next. By the time the initial shock had settled into something heavier and colder inside me, the room had shifted into an odd quiet. Conversations softened, forks hovered mid-air, and the so-called secret family my husband had presented as casually as a birthday bouquet now stood awkwardly at the edge of my living room. The weight of 30 hidden years pressed against the walls like humidity. I could feel the tension gathering behind every polite smile from the guests who had no idea where to look or what to say. It was as if everyone expected me to scream or faint or throw him out, but my silence unsettled them far more. My husband kept glancing at me, searching for a reaction, anger, sadness, humiliation, anything. But I remained steady, which seemed to unnerve him more with each passing second. He had rehearsed a different version of this moment in his mind, a version where he remained in control. A version where he delivered his shocking announcement and I crumbled, making him the figure of pity or even admiration for doing the right thing. I could see it in the way his eyes darted, waiting for the emotional explosion that never came. Instead, I observed. The woman he brought, Letitia, was composed in an unexpectedly dignified way. Her posture was straight, her expression careful, and though she avoided my eyes at first, there was a quiet strength in the way she stood beside her two adult children. They didn't resemble my husband much, but there was an unmistakable resemblance in their wary determination. They had come prepared for a battle, perhaps expecting me to attack them or deny their existence. I didn't. My silence confused them just as much. Guests began finding excuses to leave, urgent calls, babysitters, early mornings. One by one, they slipped out the door with sympathetic nods in my direction, like mourners at a wake. My husband noticed the shrinking audience, and with every goodbye his expression loosened further from confidence and closer to worry. He tried to regain footing, stepping toward me with a forced chuckle. "Well," he said lightly, attempting to smooth his voice, "now that everything is out in the open, we can finally move forward as one big family. Isn't that right?" His tone was painfully rehearsed, each word coated in artificial warmth. It was unbelievable how sincerely he expected me to welcome 30 years of betrayal like a surprise party gift that I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I studied the box I had placed earlier at the corner of the dining table. A simple, cream-colored box with a ribbon. The gift I had prepared long before I knew my birthday would unfold like a public scandal. The box had suddenly become the center of gravity in the room, though no one except me understood why. When the silence stretched too long, Letitia cleared her throat gently. "If I may," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I want to say that I didn't come here to replace you or to disrupt your life. I came because he insisted. He said you would understand." Something in her tone caught me off guard. Not guilt. Not defensiveness. Something more complicated, a burden she had carried for 3 decades, tied to choices she hadn't fully controlled. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time there was no fear in them, only fatigue and a strange sisterly sorrow. My husband quickly stepped between us, eager to control the narrative. "There's no need for all that. What's done is done. She knows I had a past. But this is my family too, and they've been living in the shadows long enough." He said it with a flourish, as though he were a politician unveiling a community center, expecting applause or gratitude. I inhaled slowly. "And you thought my birthday was the right day for this?" My voice was even, calm, colder than ice. The steadiness made him flinch. "I wanted it to be symbolic," he said, fumbling. "A new chapter. Honesty. Unity. You always said birthdays were about new beginnings." The audacity. He had twisted my own words, words I used to encourage growth, gratitude, and sincerity, into a justification for deceit. I understood then that this moment wasn't about bringing us together. It was about him cleansing his conscience, using my emotional strength as a shield for his cowardice. While he scrambled to justify himself, Letitia lowered her eyes again, but this time in shame, not for herself, but for him. Even she could see the extent of his self-centeredness. The room grew heavier, like everyone was waiting for the fuse to finally burn down. My husband approached me hesitantly, reaching out his hand as if expecting forgiveness, or at least a performance of it. "You and we've been married a long time," he said. "You've always been understanding. I knew you'd handle this with dignity." There it was. Not an apology. Not remorse. A compliment designed to pin the weight of his betrayal onto my shoulders so he wouldn't have to carry it alone, but I had anticipated more than he realized. Without a word, I walked toward the cream-colored box. The room watched. My husband brightened, assuming I was finally about to present the birthday gift he believed he deserved. He even stepped closer with an eager expression, expecting something sentimental, a gesture proving he was still central to my world. I lifted the lid gently. The rustle of tissue paper sounded louder than any voice in the room. Inside was a stack of documents. Neatly arranged. Official. Very real. My husband's smile faltered. What is that?" I held up the top folder. "This," I said clearly, "is the new beginning." Confusion rippled across his face. He looked from the papers to me as if trying to decode a foreign language. The room was so silent I could hear one of his hidden children swallow nervously. "These are the transfer authorizations," I continued. "And the filings for separation of assets. You've signed versions of these before, back when you trusted me with finances enough to sign anything I placed on the desk beside your golf magazines." His face blanched. "You, what, when did you? You weren't the only one with secrets." A shiver passed through the room. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't crying. And somehow, that terrified him more than any outburst could have. The world he thought he controlled, carefully curated, delicately hidden, smugly revealed, was slipping through his fingers faster than he could grasp it, and he wasn't ready for how much more he was about to lose. As the days following the explosive confrontation unfolded, Margaret found herself drifting between disbelief and a strange, growing sense of clarity. It was as though the confrontation that had shattered her family's carefully maintained facade had also lifted a veil she hadn't realized she'd been living behind. The truth was now out in the open, raw, sharp, undeniable, and even though the pain felt like a heavy stone lodged in her chest, it also brought with it the first breath of relief she had taken in years. She had not imagined the distance, the coldness, the subtle dismissals, and quiet betrayals. They were real, and now everyone knew it. Yet with that knowledge came a new responsibility, deciding what to do with the truth. She woke early each morning, long before the sun appeared, her mind already swirling with questions. What did she owe her husband now? What did she owe herself? And what did she owe the grandchildren who had always looked at her with innocent eyes, unaware of the adult cruelty simmering beneath the surface? For years she had tried to maintain peace, smoothing over the rough edges of family conflict the same way she smoothed wrinkles out of tablecloths before birthday dinners. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she had been the only one fighting for that peace. Everyone else, her husband, her children, even her daughter-in-law, had been perfectly content letting her carry the emotional burden as long as it meant she stayed quiet. Quiet, compliant, useful. One afternoon, she sat by the window holding a warm cup of tea, watching the neighborhood children chase each other across the street. Their laughter floated through the open window, high and bright, reminding her of a time when her own home had been filled with that same sound. Back then, she would have done anything to protect her family. Now, she wasn't even sure there was much of a family left to protect. But perhaps, she realized, she needed to stop thinking about the family as a structure she had to keep intact, and instead think about the people within it who genuinely loved her, who valued her for more than her patience or her wallet or her ability to forgive. It was a small group, but it existed. And those people deserved her strength, not her silence. The next morning, she dressed with unusual intention, choosing a soft but elegant blue blouse she hadn't worn in years. It had been a gift from her granddaughter, who once told her the color made her look like the sky after rain. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long time, studying the woman staring back. The fine lines etched around her eyes weren't signs of weakness, they were signs of living, of enduring, of surviving moments that would have crushed a less resilient heart. She felt a strange surge of determination as she picked up her bag and stepped outside, locking the door behind her with a quiet click that sounded, unexpectedly, like a beginning rather than an ending. Her first stop was the attorney's office. She hadn't planned on going. Even as she approached the building, a part of her wondered if she should turn around. But she kept walking, driven by a newfound steadiness. She needed information, clear, unbiased, practical knowledge about her rights, her finances, her options. Not because she was ready to make any drastic decisions, but because she finally understood that staying uninformed had been her greatest vulnerability. Her husband had used her trust as a shield and her silence as a weapon. She wouldn't allow that anymore. The meeting was surprisingly calm. The attorney, a patient woman with a grounded presence, listened without judgment as Margaret told her story. For the first time, Margaret laid everything out, not shakily, not timidly, but firmly, even if her voice trembled occasionally. When she finished, the attorney spoke gently but directly, explaining what Margaret's rights were, what assets legally belonged to her, what protections she had access to, and what steps she could take if she ever chose to separate her life from her husband's chaos. Hearing the information was both terrifying and empowering. She wasn't helpless, she realized. She had simply been conditioned to believe she was. When Margaret left the office, the world looked different. Brighter, sharper. She felt like her feet were touching the ground in a way they hadn't in years. She didn't want revenge, that wasn't who she was. She didn't want to punish anyone. She wanted space. Space to breathe, to think, to rebuild the parts of her life that had been worn down by neglect and betrayal. She wanted peace, not the artificial peace she had forced onto her family for years, but real peace, rooted in self-respect. When she returned home that evening, she found her husband sitting at the dining table, scrolling on his phone. He barely looked up when she walked in, muttering something about being hungry and asking what she planned to make for dinner. His tone, dismissive, entitled, careless, was painfully familiar. But this time, it hit differently. Instead of sinking into old patterns, Margaret paused in the doorway, taking a quiet breath. She realized with startling clarity that she felt nothing, not anger, not fear, not sadness. Just distance. A distance that wasn't cruel but necessary. "I'm not cooking tonight," she said simply. He finally looked up, scowling. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm taking care of myself." Her voice was calm, steady, almost gentle. It was the sound of a woman no longer asking for permission to live her own life. He scoffed, confused rather than threatened. He didn't understand, not yet, that something foundational had shifted. But he would. Eventually, Margaret walked past him without another word and made herself a simple meal, plating it carefully as though she were hosting a guest. In a way, she was. She was hosting herself, perhaps for the first time in decades, with the care she had freely given everyone else. As she ate in silence, she felt a strange, powerful sense of stillness settle inside her. Not the stillness of resignation, but the stillness of a woman gathering strength. The days following the explosive family revelation carried a strange kind of calm that felt almost unreal to Evelyn. After the chaos, shouting, and heartbreak, the quieter moments seemed heavy, as if the air itself was still processing what had happened. Her husband, now exposed and stripped of the secret he'd guarded for 30 years, moved around the house like a ghost. He spoke little, but when he did, there was an unfamiliar softness in his voice, as though he finally understood the weight of the years he had stolen from everyone involved, especially from the children he'd hidden from the world. Evelyn watched him from a distance, feeling neither pity nor anger, but a tired, quiet detachment. She had cried her tears already. She had shaken from anger already. Part of her felt that nothing he could do now would surprise her. Another part wondered what would become of the people whose lives he had derailed, hers, his secret children's, their mothers, their own emotional landscapes. She felt like the center of a storm that had passed, leaving debris scattered in every direction, but not everything felt broken. Something unexpected was happening. The children he had hidden, her stepchildren, though she had only met them days ago, began reaching out to her. First, it was small things. A text message from the eldest daughter, saying she was sorry for the pain their mother and father had caused. A call from the youngest son just to check on her well-being. A long message from the middle child explaining how they had always believed their father was a flawed man, but never imagined he had abandoned a second family rather than the first. They seemed to understand instinctively that Evelyn was also a victim of his selfishness and lies. Their compassion took her by surprise. She had expected resentment, hostility, guardedness. Instead, she received empathy and a willingness to talk. And the more they talked, the more Evelyn realized how deeply these children had suffered. They had grown up with a father who visited sporadically, always pushing responsibility onto their mother, always escaping accountability with vague excuses and sudden disappearances. They had lived through broken promises, missed birthdays, and Christmas mornings without him. They were adults now, but the remnants of childhood disappointment lingered in their voices. Evelyn found herself listening to them the way she once listened to her own children when they were young, gently, without judgment. She became a safe space they had never expected to find. It moved her deeply when one of them said, quietly, "You deserved better, too." Her own children, however, were struggling. Their father's betrayal felt like a blow to their identity. They were angry at him, angry at the secret siblings they never asked for, angry at the situation, but perhaps most surprisingly, they were fiercely protective of their mother. They visited her often, sat with her late into the night, and tried to create a new equilibrium after the family foundation cracked apart. Their presence comforted her more than words could express. One evening, while sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by half-finished cups of tea, her eldest daughter reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Mom, you are the strongest person I know," she said, with a conviction that made Evelyn's eyes fill immediately. Strength. The word felt heavy. She didn't feel strong. She felt tired. She felt worn. But she also felt something else, a sense of renewal beginning to form beneath the wreckage. Then there was the box. One of the last things she had given her husband during the confrontation, a small, elegantly wrapped box placed in his hands in front of everyone. It had caused whispers, questions, speculation. Inside the box had been a simple key, a key to the small house she had inherited from her grandmother years ago. He always assumed she had sold that house to fund renovations and vacations, never knowing she had kept it in her name alone. "You will need a place to stay," she had told him quietly at the time. That one sentence was enough to dismantle his swagger. He realized then that she was not begging for answers, not pleading for love, not hoping to salvage their marriage. She was planning her life without him. And the key, wrapped in velvet, was her way of telling him that he no longer had access to the world she was rebuilding. It was a farewell wrapped inside a gesture of icy civility. In the days that followed, he finally moved into that small old house. It was not a punishment, it was simply reality. The home they had lived in together no longer had space for the lies he had lived by. Evelyn didn't check on him. She didn't ask about his adjustment. She told herself that his life was now his own to manage, for better or worse. Some nights she wondered if he sat alone and reflected on the devastation he had caused. Other nights she didn't think of him at all, her focus shifted toward healing, not only for herself, but for the tangled family whose pieces were now interlaced with her own. She began spending time with her husband's other children, meeting them for coffee, listening to their stories, hearing their reflections. They were careful not to overstep boundaries, careful to show respect, careful to acknowledge her feelings. Their mother, however, did not reach out. And Evelyn did not expect her to. The history between them was too painful. Two women linked by the same man, joined in betrayal rather than companionship. Perhaps one day they would talk. Perhaps not. Evelyn didn't force the thought, her own children surprised her by showing an unexpected curiosity about their half-siblings. At first it was awkward, everyone unsure of what to say, how to behave, how to address the situation. But slowly, tentatively, they began to talk. Their shared resentment toward the man who had deceived them became a bridge instead of a barrier. The more they talked, the more they laughed, and the more Evelyn realized something extraordinary: the family was expanding, not breaking. Not by choice, but by circumstance. And sometimes, life's cruelest revelations brought the most unusual blessings. One afternoon, as the soft winter light poured through the living room windows, Evelyn sat surrounded by all the children, hers and his. They were talking, arguing playfully, sharing old photos. Her husband was not there. He likely never would be again. But she didn't feel the sting of his absence. Instead, she felt fullness. The room held more life, more voices, more stories than ever before. She looked around and felt something she hadn't felt in months: peace, and for the first time since the truth unraveled, Evelyn understood something profound. She hadn't lost a family. She had gained a larger one. She hadn't been broken apart. She had been reshaped. And though the path that brought her here was unfair and painful, she could finally see where it was leading. A future where she chose who stayed in her life. A future where honesty mattered more than appearances. A future where she did not carry anyone else's sins. Her husband had once believed he controlled every outcome. But he was wrong. Evelyn now saw her life clearly. And she was ready, finally, fully, and without fear, to step into the next chapter.